Welcome back to another episode of Cocktails and Tea. I am your host, Cherie. What's up, y'all? How y'all doing? Happy New Year. This year went by, it flew by, but thank God it's over and we made it, because this one was an intense one like the last couple of years has been. But moving forward, on today's episode, we're exploring the history of the Black American tradition, New Year's Eve tradition of watch night services. If you grew up in a church, especially in particular the Black church, then you probably grew up going to church on New Year's Eve. And this is a tradition that dates back to 1862, where enslaved and free people, Black people, gathered together, some in secret, to watch and wait. And you have to stay tuned to hear what they were watching and waiting for. So with that being said, if you're like me and you're a cocktail lover who's interested in history and want to learn more about the history they did not teach you in school and that they are currently taking out of schools, that's another story for another day, honey. You're going to get your cocktails ready. Today, I'm sipping on the festive sour apple champagne. Isn't she cute? She's reminiscent of like the sour apple martini. And per usual, you can have whatever cocktail or mocktail your heart so desires. But if you want to know how to make this beautiful, fun, festive, delicious cocktail, then head over to my Instagram at Cocktails and Tea, ENT, and watch the Reels video of me making this cocktail and other cocktails as well. Or you can head over to my YouTube channel, also Cocktails and Tea, ENT, if you're not already watching the video version of this podcast, of course. And you can watch my YouTube shorts where I'm making this cocktail and other cocktails as well. And as always, drink responsibly. Please and thank you. So without further ado, honey, let's get into some historical tea. Okay, so first we're going to just get into what is watch night, and then we're going to get into the history of watch night. So watch night, which is also known as Freedom's Eve, is an event that marks when free and enslaved Black people and also abolitionists all across the country watched and waited for then President Abraham Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And the very first watch night took place on December 31st, 1862. And today, Black Americans, and in particular the Black church, still observe this tradition all over the nation. And it's important to understand that this annual tradition or ritual or custom of watch night services is deeply rooted in African American tradition, religious tradition, should I say, moving forward. Okay, so now let's get into some of the history of watch night or Freedom's Eve. And we're going to briefly talk about some of the history of New Year's Day too. It's important to understand how significant Freedom's Eve was, how just the hope of freedom was to them based on how they usually would spend New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, if that makes sense. And I hope I said that clearly. But moving forward. So on the first watch night in 1862, many enslaved African Americans gathered together to sing and to pray and to worship and to dance and to just fellowship, while they watched and waited for then President Abraham Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, which it took him until like 2:00 on New Year's Day to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And legend has it, honey, that, well, not legend, facts as history records, on that day, I guess a reason why it took so long for him to sign was that he was a little nervous about signing, so much so that his hand was shaking. and that he had to take a step back, step away, gather himself before he came back to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, because he didn't want anybody to think that he second guessed his decision to free enslaved people who were in the rebellious states, the rebellious southern states. So that's just a little digression on the Emancipation Proclamation moving forward. But Black people, free or enslaved, gathering together to touch and agree at any point in time, at that time in America, let alone to watch and wait for emancipation, was a challenge. I told you some of them gathered in secret, because them gathering to worship was in general risky. So one of the reasons why it was risky was because they weren't allowed the breathing space to worship in peace, without a certain demographic of white folks with the whole spirits, saturated in the spirit of nosiness, watching them, surveilling them, spying on them, and legally a lot of the times. And according to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, quote, white enslavers feared that religion, which was often used to quell slave resistance, could incite the exact opposite if practiced without observance. Let me sip, hold up. Honey, because they couldn't even pray and worship in peace. Moving forward. I hope y'all try this, because it's not only just beautiful, but it's delicious. Moving forward. So, because they were afraid that if they gathered to worship, that they will plan some type of slave revolt, or resist in any way, they then started to implement all over the South what they called slave codes. And slave codes were a wide range of restrictive and racist and repressive laws that were made to control Black bodies, control Black people, control their movement, and also to restrict worship and restrict large gatherings, So those laws were not just for enslaved African Americans, but also for free African Americans, which is insane and brutal and inhumane. There were punishments also for anyone who violated and broken those inhumane, racist, restrictive, repressive laws. And I give you two examples of slave codes. North Carolina 1855 slave code said, quote, "It shall not be lawful any under pretense for any slave or free person of color to preach or exhort in public in any manner, to officiate as a preacher or teacher in any prayer meeting or other association for worship while slaves of different families are collected together." Child, let me still hold up. "And if any free person of color shall be thereof duly convicted on indictment before any court having jurisdiction thereof, he shall for each offense receive not exceeding 39 lashes on his bare back. And where any slave shall be guilty of violation of this act, he shall on conviction before a single magistrate receive not exceeding 39 lashes on his back." End quote. And that's the North Carolina 1855 slave code. You can't even gather to worship and preach and exalt and teach, and disgusting. Moving forward. In the 1848 Georgia slave code, which was pretty similar, but there were some nuances, some differences. It says, quote, "No person of color shall be allowed to preach, to exhort, or join in any religious exercise with any person of color, either free or slave, there being more than 7 persons of color present. Any free person of color offending against this provision to be liable on conviction for the first offense to imprisonment at the discretion of the court, and to a penalty not exceeding $500 to be levied on the property of the person of color. If this is insufficient, he shall be sentenced to be whipped and imprisoned at the discretion of the court." Had a sip on that. This is just disgusting. Moving forward. "Provided such imprisonment shall not exceed 6 months, and no whipping shall exceed 39 lashes, end quote. So they had to gather and worship in secrecy. And, despite these restrictive, repressive, racist laws, enslaved people would come together to worship and touch and agree anyway. And shout out to them, and rightfully so, as they should. And they would do so at praise houses, on the plantation, or secretly in the woods, or in ravines, or the brush, or in swamps even. And those secret worship gatherings were called hush harbors, or hush arbors, or brush harbors, or brush arbors. I guess that really just depends on what region in the South you were in, what plantation you were on, whatever, But those were the names for those secret worship gatherings. So enslaved people would risk it all just to gather together and to worship and to practice their religious customs, and even to gather together to watch and wait for freedom. And I think that, I'm gonna drink some libations just for the ancestors, because yes, honey, baby, if Black people don't do nothing else, honey, we gonna make a way. We gonna make a way. We persevere, moving forward. So I want to briefly talk about like New Year's Eve and New Year's Day before Freedom's Eve, because I just want to drive home the point of how significant December 31st, 1862 was for a lot of them. How they stayed up all night to watch and wait for Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And again, even though he didn't do it till 2:00 p.m. on New Year's Day, but I think the sentiment of them staying up to watch and wait and to pray in the new year and pray out the old one, pray in the new year and pray in and usher in emancipation and freedom. I think that that's beautiful and significant. But before Freedom's Eve and the emancipation being signed on January 1st, 1863, New Year's Day for enslaved people was a day that they dreaded. It was a day that they dreaded, and it was widely referred to as Heartbreak Day or Hiring Day. And that's because before enslaved people watched and waited for emancipation, they would spend New Year's Eve waiting and wondering if their family was going to be split, or if the trash ass human who felt that it was okay to own other human beings, if they would rent them out potentially for the year, or if they were going to be sold altogether. So renting out enslaved people for labor throughout the year was a very common and profitable a custom in America at this time. And per time.com, quote, some enslaved people were put up for auction that day or held under contracts that started in January. And also, according to professor and expert on history, on history of New Year's Eve and New Year's Day in America, her name is Alexis McCrossan. She said, quote, hiring day was part of a large economic cycle in which most debts were collected and settled on New Year's Day. So if the enslaver owed any debts, they would pay those debts by renting out, human beings. Let me sip. And again, that's the reason why I feel Freedom's Eve was so significant and important. And they celebrated the way that they did was because Heartbreak Day was a day that they dreaded. And 1862, December 31st, 1862 was a day that they knew the next day in 1863 that came with the promise of freedom. And I think that was huge. And I think the promise of freedom was significant enough for them to stay up all night to celebrate and dance and worship and pray and fellowship and welcome their freedom. And so again, shout out to the ancestors for that. So moving on, I told you I didn't tell you, but this is going to be a short and sweet episode. We are already wrapping up. And with that, we're going to move on to the legacy of Watch Night. Oh yeah, this is a short episode. I didn't want to be before you long, so you have time to go out and celebrate. If this come out on New Year's Eve, I'm going to do my best to put this out on New Year's Eve, but it's going to be out New Year's Day at the latest. New Year's Day at the latest, moving forward. So let's move on to the legacy of Freedom's Eve and Watch Night, and also some of our New Year's Day traditions now. So Watch Night services was originally meant to usher in freedom, to welcome in freedom, to pray in freedom and pray out the old year. And today, the annual tradition encourages us to reflect on our history and our freedom and how far we've come, and also to how far we have to go. You're able to kind of take stock of the year, reflect on the passing year, and anticipate the new blessings that the new year will bring. And Watch Night services today start at either 7 p.m. or 10 p.m. It depends on the church. And it's also common for multiple churches to partner and join their Watch Night services. At Watch Night services, it's pretty much like how the original Watch Night service was. You pray and you worship, and there's dancing, there's testimony, there's a reading of the oral history, there's sermons, and it's also a Watch Night tradition to be in prayer minutes before the new year, the stroke of midnight comes in. So you begin the year praying. Also, collard greens and black eyed peas are customary or traditional New Year's Day dishes. And these culinary customs are rooted in Southern superstitions. But this particular Southern superstitions of like black eyed peas and all of that is influenced by West African traditions and West African beliefs. So what collard greens and black eyed peas represent, collard greens represents like prosperity or the promise of prosperity, and black eyed peas are believed to bring luck to those who eat them. So traditionally on New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, you have collard greens, black eyed peas, and the other sides depending on, the household and you. And with that, honey, I am done. Yes, this is a short and sweet episode. I didn't want to be before you long. I just want to briefly come and just talk about the history of the Black American New Year's Eve tradition of watch night. And with that, honey, I'm going to move on to the Shots for the Road. And for those who don't know what Shots for the Road is a song lyric or a quote that either ties in with the episode or that I just find badass. And, I just wanted to quote it. So, but this one actually ties in with the episode. This is a quote from Frederick Douglass about watch night. And I believe he gave this speech. Which I'm going to quote just a small portion of it. I think he gave it on December 31st, 1862. If he didn't, then it was a few weeks before. But it was he gave it in December 1862. Let's just say that. So here's his quote about Freedom's Eve, or watch night. Quote, "It's a day for poetry and song, a new song. These cloudless skies, this balmy air, this brilliant sunshine are in harmony with the glorious morning of liberty about to dawn upon us." Honey, and with that, I am done. Thank you for listening to another episode of Cocktails and Tea. If you want to connect with me, then head over to cocktailsandteapodcast.com, where you can connect with me on Instagram, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, where you can watch the video version of this podcast if you're not already, and also some of my stand-up comedy videos as well. Also, your reviews really encourage me and they help other people find this podcast. So if my podcast ever made you laugh or think, then please rate, review, and share it with a friend. If you're watching this on YouTube, then please like, subscribe, and share. And also leave a comment. And let's continue the discussion down in the comment section. Until next time. Thank you. Love, light, and insight, boo. Cheers.